I remember the way the light fell through the window that morning, soft and golden, casting long shadows across the floor, as I sat at the old oak table with my reading glasses perched on the bridge of my nose. I'd been flipping through catalogs and browsing online for hours, my cup of tea gone cold beside me. It wasn't just a birthday gift I was looking for, it was a gesture, a reminder. I wanted her to feel seen. I wanted her to know I had paid attention all these years. I remembered she once mentioned in passing how much she loved old lace patterns and hand-stitched linens. It was a tiny detail, but I clung to it like a thread. I found a beautiful antique lace table runner from an estate in the English countryside, delicately restored, wrapped in parchment, smelling faintly of lavender and thyme. I paid extra to have it framed with a small brass plaque engraved, "For the table where your family gathers." I thought it was poetic. I thought it would mean something. The gift arrived 2 days before the party. I held it in my hands, admiring the intricacy of the threads, the softness of age woven into each loop. I even thought for a moment that she might cry when she opened it. Not out of sadness, but surprise. People forget that older women can be sentimental too, that we remember every kindness, every cold shoulder. I was hoping to remind her that I was still here, still thoughtful, still trying. I tied the package myself with ivory ribbon and a single pressed flower beneath the bow. A small note tucked inside read, "May your table always be full, and your heart even more." So I rehearsed how I would hand it to her with a smile, how she might say something like, "You always give the most meaningful things." I let myself daydream about belonging again. The day of the party, I wore my navy blouse, the one with the soft pleats and the little pearl buttons she once complimented. I told myself to walk in with grace, not need. But the truth was, I needed something I couldn't name. Not applause, not gratitude, just a little warmth. Just one sincere, unforced moment of connection. I arrived early, as I always do, eager to help to offer something of myself that wasn't wrapped in paper. The house buzzed with activity, streamers, balloons, laughter bouncing off the walls. Children darted past my knees, and someone placed a drink in my hand before I could even take off my coat. I smiled, nodding, hugging familiar faces, who looked through me more than at me. The gift sat in my lap for a while, untouched, until finally I placed it gently on the gift table, nestled between bright, glossy bags, with ribbons as large as bouquets. Mine looked modest among them, maybe even plain, but I didn't let that shake me. I reminded myself, love doesn't need to scream. When the time came to open the gifts, everyone gathered in a loose circle, drinks in hand. Camera phones pointed. She smiled brightly as she opened box after box, designer scarves, spa certificates, perfume bottles in mirrored wrapping. Then she picked mine up. For a moment I saw a flicker of curiosity on her face, maybe even a softness. She untied the ribbon, peeled back the paper. The room quieted just slightly. She stared at it for a heartbeat too long. Then she laughed, sharp, dismissive. "Oh, how quaint." A few polite chuckles rippled around the room. Someone said, "Is that like old fabric or something?" Another voice chimed in. "It looks like something from Grandma's attic." She didn't correct them. She didn't explain. She simply set it aside, said thank you, without looking me in the eye, and moved on to the next box. I sat there, hands clasped in my lap, smile frozen in place like porcelain. I nodded. I swallowed. I laughed softly as if I were in on the joke. But my heart felt like that lace delicate unraveled walked over. I wondered if she even read the note, if she even noticed the engraving, if the word family had ever meant the same thing to her as it still meant to me. Later, someone asked her where the lace came from, and I heard her shrug. "Some online shop, probably," she said. "It's sweet, I guess. Just looks a little cheap." That word, cheap. It echoed in my chest like a church bell on a winter morning hollow, loud, uninvited. I stood there pretending to refill my glass, pretending I hadn't heard, pretending it didn't matter. But something inside me shifted in that moment. Not like a crack, more like a quiet final closing of a door I had been holding open far too long. The moment I stepped into their house, I felt it, that faint but unmistakable air of distance. It wasn't coldness exactly. No one slammed a door or gave me a cruel look. No, it was more like I was floating just slightly above the floor, like I was there, but not quite there. I walked through the entryway, where years ago my son used to run up and hug me before I even had time to knock. Now no one met me at the door. The house was decorated beautifully, of course, streamers in soft pastels, a cake the size of a coffee table, a tower of gifts taller than some of the children running circles through the crowd. And yet the warmth that used to greet me was missing, like someone had replaced it with party-scented candles and glossy surface smiles. I tried to help in the kitchen, offering to slice fruit or arrange the appetizers, but I was gently shooed away. "Don't worry, Mom. We've got this." I smiled and backed off, as I've learned to do over the years, but that smile didn't reach my chest. I wandered to the sitting room and greeted people I half recognized, neighbors, co-workers, friends of friends, all speaking in that brisk tone people use when they want to acknowledge you, but not engage you. It made me ache, because I remembered birthdays past where I brought the cupcakes strung. The balloons was the first one they called when something was forgotten. Now I was a guest, and not a special one. I sat near the edge of a couch, smoothing the creases in my skirt, watching the way my daughter-in-law floated through the room with her practiced charm, touching arms, tilting her head, just so, her laughter like glass wind chimes. I could tell she was in her element. She loved being admired, loved being seen. But I wondered if she ever truly saw me. I looked around the room at all the younger women with their blowouts and stiletto heels, comparing handbags and vacation destinations. I used to worry I'd never fit in. Now I realized I was never meant to. I was tolerated, perhaps appreciated in a vague ceremonial way, but not known, not cherished. At some point, someone handed me a glass of sparkling water. No wine, no plate of hors d'oeuvres, just something to hold. I stood near the corner of the room like a side table, smiling at nothing, nodding at people who barely looked my way. I spotted my son once or twice darting in and out of conversations, adjusting the music, checking on the food. When he finally saw me, he smiled, with that rushed, polite affection that comes when someone realizes they forgot a detail in the middle of hosting. He kissed my cheek. "Glad you made it, Mom," he said, already turning before I could answer. I whispered, "Of course," to his back. I clutched my handbag and wandered into the dining room, where the table was set with crystal glasses and gold-trimmed plates. I ran my hand along the edge of the polished wood I remembered sanding with him years ago when he got it second-hand, and I helped him restore it. Back then, he was proud to show me his work, to ask for my advice. Now the table was pristine, but I was invisible. I spotted the gift table across the room, mountains of metallic wrapping paper, silk ribbons, and glossy tags with names, written in calligraphy. Mine sat off to the side. It was wrapped plainly, intentionally, so because I thought subtlety was elegant, but now it just looked forgotten, like an afterthought. I began to question everything. Should I have gone with something flashier? A designer purse, a spa voucher, a necklace? But no, I reminded myself I chose something meaningful, something real. Still, that seed of doubt began to root. Maybe I had misjudged. Maybe the language of meaning had changed, and I hadn't kept up. The laughter in the room started to rise as the drinks flowed, and the compliments bounced from wall to wall. "You look amazing," they said to her. "Where did you get that dress? You throw the best parties." She accepted each word like a queen receiving tribute, her smile never faltering. I stood in the back, my hands folded neatly, watching her bathe in praise that felt as rehearsed as the photos being snapped every 2 minutes. Then came the time to open gifts. A small hush fell over the room. Cameras were raised. She sat center stage on a cushioned chair, the kind you might see in a bridal shower. Box after box was opened, everyone met with squeals of delight, gasps, grateful hugs. And when she picked up mine, that moment of silence felt different, like even the wrapping was a disappointment. Her smile faltered just enough for me to notice. She tore the paper more quickly than the others. No pause, no curiosity, just a flick of her fingers, a blink, a faint lift of her eyebrow. And then the words, "Oh, how quaint." That tiny phrase dropped like a stone in my chest. That was the moment the party felt off, in a way I couldn't recover from. Because it wasn't just the gift. It wasn't even the laugh. It was the ripple I felt inside as I realized that everything I'd tried to hold on to, all the shared memories, the gentle gestures, the tiny offerings of love, had been reclassified in her world as irrelevant, cheap, quaint. I tried to stay to smile to survive the cake and candles and small talk, but the rest of the evening passed in a blur. I remember standing by the kitchen window watching the sky darken, wondering if this is what it felt like to quietly vanish while still being in the room. I hadn't planned to linger near the hallway, but my feet had carried me there, half searching for quiet, half escaping the way the party's cheer seemed to grow louder with every hollow laugh. I stood near the guest bathroom, adjusting my scarf in the mirror above the sideboard when I heard them. Her voice first unmistakable, crisp and sharp, with the same polish she wore like perfume. She gave me this thing, she said, with a smirk, in her tone loud enough for the other woman to catch, but not so loud as to seem cruel. That's how she always wielded her words, just soft enough to feign innocence, just loud enough to cut. It's some old scrap of lace in a box. Looks like something you'd find in a thrift store. Honestly, it felt like a leftover from one of her projects. Laughter followed. Not the full-bellied kind, but the kind that nicks the soul tight, knowing almost conspiratorial. One of her friends said, "Well, it's sweet that she tried." Another added, "You'd think she'd know better by now." Tried. That word. As if I were a child fumbling with crayons, not a woman who had folded decades of care into that single gesture. As if all my love and history had been reduced to some pitiful attempt. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, eyes fixed on the framed photo on the wall. My son and her on their wedding day, both of them laughing. I was just out of frame. I remember that day. I'd held her veil, made her bouquet from roses in my garden, stayed up until midnight, sewing pearls into the hem of her dress. I remembered thinking she'd become my daughter that day. Now I realized she never saw me as more than a fixture, an extension of him, a necessity, not a choice. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned away from the wall. My first instinct was to leave, to flee, to pretend I'd forgotten something in the car, to vanish like a ghost before the final slice of cake. But no, I stayed. I'm not sure why. Maybe because I didn't want to give them that satisfaction. Or maybe because I still held on to some sliver of pride that demanded I stand my ground, even if it was shaking beneath me. When I re-entered the main room, I wore my smile like a stitched-up wound, tidy on the surface, raw underneath. My son caught my eye across the room. I wondered, had he heard? Would he defend me if he had? But he looked away, too quickly busying himself with a platter of cupcakes, avoiding the part of me that was breaking. Later, when the candles had been blown out and the crowd began to thin, she passed me in the hallway again. I said nothing, just nodded. She gave me that tight, closed-lip smile people use when they want to seem polite without engaging, and then she said it. "Thank you again for the unique gift. It's definitely one of a kind." It was the way she said definitely that tore through me. Not gratitude, not even indifference, just thinly veiled dismissal. My tongue was thick with things I didn't say, like how I had spent 3 nights looking for the perfect thread of history in that lace, or how the plaque was made by a craftsman who used to carve war medals, or how I had once imagined us sitting at that table, laughing over shared stories, that runner lying between us like common ground. Instead, I smiled, again, because that's what we do, isn't it? We women of a certain age, we absorb, we swallow, we fold our pain into little napkin corners so it doesn't drip on anyone else's celebration. But I felt it then, a slow blooming of something I hadn't touched in years. Not rage, not even sorrow. No, this was something else, older, deeper, like a remembering of who I used to be before I twisted myself into softness for the comfort of others, before I let myself be defined by whether or not I was appreciated, before I let mother become the only identity that mattered. She had called my gift cheap, but what she didn't realize was that it wasn't just about the item. It was about the years that had gone into the hands that wrapped it. And those hands were not cheap. They had wiped tears, scrubbed floors, built homes, bandaged knees, and signed paychecks with aching joints. Those hands were full of worth, and I had forgotten that. Until now. When I finally left coat buttoned high and breath slow in the cold night air, I paused on the porch and looked up at the moon. It was low and wide like an old friend keeping quiet company. I took one long breath, then whispered to myself, that was the last time. Not just the last time I would let myself be humiliated like that, but the last time I would hand over my worth and wait for someone else to hold it gently. It's a strange thing how people can smile at you with their mouths and still keep you miles away with their eyes. That night, I saw a dozen smiles, maybe more. Some wide, some practiced, some a little too bright. And not a single one of them felt real. Not the way they used to. Not the way my husband used to smile at me from across the table just for refilling his glass. Not the way my son used to grin when I packed his favorite sandwich for lunch. These smiles were painted on like stage makeup, temporary, decorative, hollow. I saw it most in my son. He smiled when he greeted me, smiled when I handed over the gift, smiled when he saw me standing alone by the window. But not once did I feel that warmth reach out and touch me. That invisible thread, the one that used to tie us together like string around a bundle of letters, had thinned, frayed, maybe even snapped. He used to come over just to check on me to see if I needed help with the garden or fixing the porch screen. He used to sit at the kitchen counter while I stirred soup, telling me about work and the books he was reading. He used to look at me like I was someone he chose to be around. But that night, his glances skimmed past me like I was furniture. Polite, brief, forgettable. I watched the way he looked at his wife, how his eyes lingered on her when she laughed, how he leaned in when she spoke, how he seemed to follow her cues like a shadow. I used to think they had such a beautiful partnership, but now I wondered, was he truly seeing her or just playing the role he believed a good husband should? And then there was the way he didn't defend me. That part stuck in my chest like a fishbone. He must have heard her mocking me. Maybe not the first time, maybe not the words, but the tone, the energy, the dismissal. He felt it. I know he did. And yet, silence. That was the part that hurt more than anything she said. The silence, that quiet agreement, that letting it happen. Because sometimes the worst betrayals are not from the words spoken in cruelty, but from the people who let those words echo unchallenged. People who know you, who should know better. I tried to convince myself that he didn't want to cause a scene, that maybe he planned to talk to her later, that maybe he thought I hadn't heard. But deep down, I knew better. He was choosing comfort over courage, peace over principle, appearances over authenticity. And the rest of them? Her friends, our extended family, even some of the younger cousins who used to sit on my lap begging me for stories. They smiled, they waved, but no one came and sat beside me. No one asked about the gift. No one told me it was lovely or thoughtful or anything at all. I became invisible in plain sight, a ghost in good shoes. I stood by the fireplace for a long time pretending to admire the family photos. Most of them didn't include me. There was one tucked into the corner of a collage frame that showed me holding my grandson as a baby. I remember that moment vividly. He had just stopped crying when I hummed the same lullaby my mother used to sing to me. His little hand gripped my blouse like he knew I was safety. I wonder if he still feels that way, or if he's already learning by example which people in the family deserve attention, and which ones are just background. I watched them gather around the cake. The candles flickered, everyone singing loudly, off-key but joyous. I clapped, of course, smiled naturally, but inside it was like watching someone else's life, one I used to be part of. One that had quietly closed the door behind me without a goodbye. And maybe I could have swallowed all of that. Maybe I could have gone home, cried into my pillow, and told myself I was just being sensitive. But it was the way they smiled without love, without recognition, that made it impossible. Those smiles didn't say, "We're happy you're here." They said, "We didn't notice you were gone." So I stood there among people I once considered my own and realized I had become a guest in a place I helped build. I had knitted blankets for their babies, cooked for their birthdays, mended torn hems and aching hearts. But all that history, it didn't seem to weigh anything anymore. It was lighter than a ribbon, easier to toss aside. I felt like an old photograph, framed but fading. On the drive home, I tried to think of the last time I had felt truly welcomed, not just included, but wanted, not tolerated, not politely nodded at, but seen. It had been a long time. The night air was cold against my face as I stepped outside, the warmth of the house behind me already fading like a memory I didn't want to keep. No one walked me to the door. No one called out, "Drive safe," or asked if I needed help with my coat. I pulled it tighter around my shoulders and made my way down the steps slowly, carefully, my heels clicking against the pavement, the silence wrapping around me like an old cardigan I hadn't worn in years. When I got to the car, I sat there for a while without turning the key, just breathing, letting the quiet press in on all sides. The gift I had so lovingly wrapped still sat in that house, unloved, misunderstood, mocked. But the part that hurt more was that I had been left there too, in the corners, in the silence, in the laughter that rolled around me, but never included me. My presence had become just another part of the background, like the coat rack or the lamp in the hallway, useful perhaps, but only if someone needed something. As I drove, the headlights cast long shadows over the road ahead, and I found myself slipping back into memories, like potholes in the pavement. I thought of all the drives I used to take with my son when he was little, how we used to sing along to old folk songs, his small voice mangling the lyrics while I laughed so hard I'd have to pull over. I thought of how he used to reach for my hand at red lights just to feel me there. When did that stop? I passed the diner we used to go to after his soccer games, the one with the greasy fries, and the jukebox that only played if you gave it a firm tap. I hadn't been there in years, but suddenly I wanted to stop, to sit in the corner booth and order a milkshake, to remember when love was easy and loud and uncomplicated. But I didn't stop. I kept driving. The roads were nearly empty, the way they get when the night has gone too far into itself. A part of me felt like those streets used to carrying so much weight, now worn down and mostly forgotten. I thought of the way her voice had curled around that word cheap, as if it tasted sour in her mouth. And then I thought of all the years I'd spent stretching every penny to keep a roof over our heads, sewing curtains from old sheets, turning leftovers into Sunday meals. Nothing I've ever given has been cheap. It's all been carved from effort, laced with sacrifice, wrapped in care. If she couldn't see that it wasn't because it wasn't there, it was because she never looked. I turned off the radio. The silence was easier than the cheerful songs that suddenly felt like lies. I rolled down the window just a crack and let the cold air sting my cheek, hoping it would keep the tears from falling. But they did, quietly. Not the kind you sob out loud, but the kind that pool gently and fall without asking, like rain from a gray sky that doesn't need thunder to be heavy. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the porch light flickered on like a loyal friend. My house, small, a little tired around the edges, welcomed me in the way no person had that evening. I stepped inside, closed the door, and leaned against it for a moment, listening to the familiar creaks of the floorboards, the hum of the old refrigerator, the whisper of the night pressing against the windows. It was lonely, yes, but it was mine. I made myself a cup of tea, the kind I always keep for moments like this, jasmine delicate and floral, the way I like it. I sat in my chair by the window and looked out into the dark. Somewhere not too far away, the house I had just left was still filled with chatter and clinking glasses. I pictured them laughing, maybe even retelling the joke about the quaint gift. I imagined the box pushed aside the lace gathering dust beneath a pile of tissue paper. And then I thought, what else have they pushed aside? It wasn't just the gift. It was the years, the memories, the traditions I tried to pass on, the phone calls I waited for and never received, the meals I cooked that went unpraised, the advice I gave that was ignored, the love I poured out like water into a bowl with no bottom. I sipped my tea slow and quiet and let the bitterness dissolve on my tongue. And somewhere between one swallow and the next, something began to shift inside me. Not rage, not yet, just a loosening, a slow, quiet unraveling of all the knots I'd tied myself into trying to belong, trying to stay relevant, trying not to be a burden. I began to think not just about that night, but about all the times I'd swallowed the small slights, let them build like sediment on the floor of my spirit. How many times had I heard, "She means well," when I was hurt? How often had I been told to let it go, to not take it personally, when it felt like I was being erased? And more importantly, how much longer was I willing to play this part? I glanced over at the drawer by my writing desk, the one where I kept my will tucked neatly between utility bills and old insurance forms. I hadn't opened it in years, but suddenly I could feel it calling to me, not out of spite, but out of something older, something that had slept quietly inside me until now, something that whispered, "Remember who you are." That night, long after the tea had gone cold in my hands, I sat in the dark with nothing but the hum of the heater and the whisper of wind against the window pane. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't check my phone. I just sat with myself, surrounded by shadows and memories. They came easily, as they always do, when the world outside grows quiet and the house folds inward on itself. Not loud memories, but soft ones. The kind that knock gently before entering, I thought of birthdays from long ago, when the living room was filled with balloons I'd blown up myself, strung along banisters with twine. My son's little hands had clapped with joy over paper hats and a cake I'd baked from scratch, lopsided and imperfect but still devoured. Back then, he didn't need grandeur. Just me, just love. I remembered how he used to press drawings into my hands, crayon masterpieces of our family stick figures, with big smiles, and a sun with too many rays. I used to tape them to the fridge like sacred art, and he'd beam when he saw them there like he'd given me the Mona Lisa, because to him I was the museum, I was the place where his love was displayed. I remembered holidays when I'd set the table with care folding napkins into little swans polishing silverware until it caught the candlelight. The turkey roasted slowly while the scent of cinnamon rolls curled into the corners of the house. He would sit next to me asking if he could sneak a bite before dinner, and I'd pretend to say no before slipping him a warm roll anyway. We'd share a grin. That grin could have lit a street lamp. But over time those moments dimmed. Traditions gave way to convenience. Dinners became takeout containers. Conversations shrank into texts. And somewhere along the way I stopped being the center of his orbit and became something more distant, like a moon that was useful for lighting the night, but no longer something to marvel at. I don't blame him for growing up. Children are supposed to leave to build to bloom. I always knew that. I raised him to be strong, independent, to love fully and live freely. But I never expected to feel forgotten in the very life I helped him build. I remembered one day, maybe 10 years ago, when he brought her his then girlfriend, now wife, to the house for the first time. She had been polite, even sweet in that way young women often are when they aren't sure how much to reveal. I made her tea, offered her a blanket for the porch swing. She complimented my curtains and asked me for the recipe to my chicken stew. I remember feeling a flutter of hope. Maybe she would be like a daughter. Maybe this would be the beginning of something new. I sewed her a scarf that Christmas, hand-stitched soft wool, a warm rust color I thought would flatter her. She never wore it. I saw it in a bin in the garage the next spring, still folded neatly, still tagged with the little note I'd written to keep you warm when the wind turns. I never asked why it ended up there. I didn't want to hear the answer. But that was the first time I felt something wilt. And then came the gradual erosion, the missed calls, the forgotten birthdays, the way my ideas for family holidays were so sweet, but maybe next year. I became someone they visited out of duty, someone whose stories they half listened to while scrolling their phones. But back then, before all of this, I mattered. I was the keeper of the stories, the singer of lullabies, the healer of scraped knees, the finder of lost toys and broken hearts. I was the woman who carried the weight of their world so they could run freely through it. I remembered how he used to reach for me in crowded rooms, how even as a teenager he'd squeeze my hand in the car when he didn't have words. He once told me after his first heartbreak that I was the only person who made the world feel safe again. "You're my home, Mom," he said. I carried that sentence for years like a pearl in my pocket. Where had that boy gone? And maybe the better question, where had I gone? Because somewhere in all the giving I had forgotten to hold on to pieces of myself. I had thinned myself out until I could be draped over anyone's need. I had been so focused on being useful, being kind, being patient, that I stopped being whole. I stood up from my chair and walked slowly to the hallway, my hand trailing along the wall. I passed the photographs, some framed, some taped, some curling at the edges. There was my husband's laugh frozen in a still from our 25th anniversary. There was my son in his graduation gown, smiling at me like I had hung the moon. There was me holding a pie, cradling a baby, kissing a skinned knee. I stopped in front of one picture in particular, a candid shot from the old days, me and my son sitting on the floor, building a model train set. He was 6 and his mouth was open in a giggle. My face was tilted toward him, eyes soft hand, steady on the track. That was a woman who mattered. That was a woman who was seen. And standing there barefoot in the hallway, wrapped in silence and memory, I whispered something I hadn't said out loud in years. I still matter. I said it again, a little louder. Not for anyone else to hear. Just for me. It's never just one moment, is it? Never just one sentence, or a single party. No, the real heartbreak, the kind that seeps in and settles deep like dust in an old house. It arrives slowly, quietly. It hides in small things, glances that slide past you, invitations that never come, conversations where you speak and no one truly listens. That night opened a door I'd been pretending didn't exist. I stood in my kitchen the next morning pouring coffee into the same mug I'd used for over 20 years, and I began to count. Not numbers, no wounds. Tiny, almost invisible insults that I had brushed off as misunderstandings as harmless. But they weren't harmless, not when they stacked on top of each other for years. I remembered the time I baked a pie for their anniversary dinner, spent the afternoon rolling the crust by hand, slicing the apples, adding the cinnamon, just the way he liked. When I arrived, she told me in front of everyone that they'd already picked up a dessert from a trendy new bakery. But thank you, she said, waving her manicured hand like I was a well-meaning pet. My pie was never opened. I took it home and ate a slice alone in my kitchen while the evening replayed behind my eyes like a film with the wrong soundtrack. Then there was the Christmas I offered to host, just like I had for decades. I decorated the house, pulled the old ornaments from the attic, scrubbed the silverware till it shone. 3 days before they canceled, said her sister had invited them instead, and it was just easier. They sent photos from that dinner, matching outfits, coordinated table settings, a caption that read, "Family means everything." Or the birthday they almost forgot entirely, a brief text message sent at noon. "Happy birthday. Hope it's a good one. No call, no card, no visit." I sat on my porch that evening, a candle flickering beside me on the table, singing happy birthday softly to myself, just to fill the space. Even the small, careless things began to cut deeper, the way she introduced me at gatherings. This is his mom, not by my name, not even by mom, just a tag, an add-on. As though I were an accessory to his identity, not someone who had shaped it with years of love and sacrifice. And every time I was hurt, I told myself not to make waves, not to be dramatic. I'd say, "They're just busy," or "She doesn't mean it that way," or "I'm sure he'll call tomorrow." I offered them benefit after benefit of the doubt until the ledger tilted so far in their favor that I was left empty-handed. Why do we do that, we women? We mothers. We make ourselves small to keep the peace. We stay quiet so they'll be comfortable. We let our hearts bruise over and over and still show up with a smile and a casserole. Somewhere along the way, our generosity becomes expectation, and then obligation, and then irrelevance. I even remembered the way she would sigh when I told the same story twice, or how my son would subtly check his phone mid-sentence when I was speaking, the way they once brought store-bought soup to my house after my knee surgery, dropped it off at the door, and left without even stepping inside. No one sat with me. No one asked how the nights were, how the quiet felt when the pain wouldn't let me sleep. These things on their own seem so small, but together they add up to a loud silence. A long goodbye no one had the courage to speak aloud. And I let it happen, because I thought if I just loved them enough, they'd remember how to love me back. That if I stayed soft, they'd soften too. That if I kept showing up, kept giving, kept forgiving, eventually they'd look up and see me there tired, but trying. But they didn't. I stood at the sink, hands deep in dishwater, and thought about how often I had given away pieces of myself in the name of family. I had put their comfort before my dignity, their needs before my own. I had accepted scraps of affection and called it a meal. No more. The realization didn't come like thunder. It came like sunrise, slow, golden, undeniable. A soft light cast over the life I'd been living, showing me all the cracks I'd pretended not to see. I dried my hands on a towel older than her marriage, folded it neatly, and walked down the hallway. My knees ached slightly the way they always do in the morning, but I moved with purpose. Into the spare bedroom, the one I had turned into a little reading space after my husband passed, and there on the shelf sat a small stack of journals. I pulled one down the cover, worn the spine curved from use. Inside were decades of lists, things I wanted to remember, moments I never wanted to forget, first steps, last conversations, words that healed, words that hurt. I turned to a blank page and wrote a single sentence. They stopped seeing me, so I will stop shrinking. And I underlined it slowly, twice. After I closed the journal, I sat for a long time in that quiet room, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, but heavy, like sitting in a chapel long after the service has ended. The walls around me still held echoes not of laughter, but of voices that once mattered. One, in particular, my husband's. He's been gone 8 years now. Some days it feels like 8 minutes, other days 8 lifetimes. But that morning it felt like he was right there, in the room with me. Like his absence had shape and weight. Like he had left behind more than just a folded flag and a drawer of old neckties. He had left a voice that still knew how to reach me. I could hear him clear as day from some old memory, maybe from a kitchen conversation, or one of our long porch talks when the sun was low and we didn't need to fill the silence. Don't wait until it's too late to remind people who you are. He used to say that when I was doubting myself, when I gave too much without return, when someone crossed a line and I was too polite to draw it again. He was never loud. He wasn't the kind of man who shouted to be heard, but when he spoke, it stuck. He had this quiet conviction about dignity, about not letting the world decide your worth for you, about drawing boundaries even with people you loved, especially when they began to forget that you were a whole person and not just a role. I remember once early in our marriage I was upset because someone at his office had said something condescending about my homemaking. I had brushed it off with a laugh, but it stayed with me, gnawed at me, made me feel small. That night he took my hands, looked me in the eye and said, "You don't need anyone else's permission to be proud of what you've built. You stand tall in it, and if they don't see it, that's their blindness, not your failing." Those words came back to me now stronger than ever, because isn't that what I'd been doing for years, waiting for permission to feel proud, waiting for acknowledgement to validate the life I had given, waiting for people who had stopped seeing me to finally look again and say, "Thank you, I see you." But maybe I didn't need to be seen by them anymore. Maybe I just needed to see myself again. I reached for the worn photograph of us on the shelf, our 30th anniversary standing in the garden, flowers blooming behind us, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. His eyes were creased at the corners from smiling. That man loved me, not for what I did or gave or managed, but for who I was. He used to say I had strong hands and a soft heart, and that I should never let the world confuse the two. I could almost feel his presence leaning in, whispering, "You've done enough bending. Now it's time to stand." And so I did. I stood up from that chair like I was someone again, someone with spine, someone with voice, someone with history that didn't need to be dressed up in bows to matter. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and opened the drawer where I kept my files, utility bills, insurance papers, and tucked between them the envelope marked "Last Will" and "Testament." I slid it out with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks, maybe months. I placed it gently on the table alongside a pad of paper and a pen and just stared at it for a moment. When I first wrote that will years ago, it had been filled with love, with generosity, with dreams of being remembered not just for what I left behind, but for the thoughtfulness in each bequest. Every item, every dollar, every heirloom had been chosen with care, meant to continue weaving love into the fabric of their lives. I imagined my granddaughter reading the letter that came with my wedding locket. I pictured my son finding comfort in the keepsakes from his childhood home. I even imagined my daughter-in-law someday wearing one of my scarves and smiling because she finally understood the kind of care that made something last. But now I saw how misplaced those dreams were. The scarf had ended up in a donation box. The locket would probably be sold or forgotten. And the money, well, it would disappear into things that glimmer and fade. I thought of all the people over the years who had poured kindness into me when I was tired, when I was grieving, when I felt like the world had moved on without me. Neighbors who shoveled my driveway without being asked. Nurses who stayed a little longer just to make sure I didn't feel alone. The woman at the grocery store who always asked how I was and actually waited for the answer. Small kindnesses, deep impacts. They remembered me, maybe not with parties or grand gestures, but with care. And then I thought of causes I believed in, shelters, literacy programs, community kitchens, places where love wasn't decorative, it was survival, where things weren't measured in price but in presence. That's where my heart began to turn, not in bitterness, but in clarity. I would rewrite the will, not to punish, but to free myself, to stop handing pieces of my soul to people who treated it like scrap paper, to start leaving love where it would bloom, not wither. I smiled softly as I sipped my coffee, the steam rising into the morning light like a quiet blessing. He would be proud of me, my husband, not for the decision itself, but for remembering that I still had the right to make one. "Don't wait until it's too late," he had said. And I wouldn't. The original copy sat before me like a closed book of poetry, each page once written with hope, each line a soft offering of love. When I first drafted it, I remember feeling so deeply connected to the people I was writing it for. Every item had a memory attached. Every line was meant to carry some trace of me into the future. I didn't want to just leave things. I wanted to leave meaning. I wanted them to feel my presence even after I was gone. I had written my son's name carefully on the line next to the house, imagining him unlocking the door one day and feeling wrapped in comfort, surrounded by the walls where he took his first steps. I imagined his children laughing in the same backyard where he once dug holes for imaginary dinosaurs. I had even added a note tucked into the envelope reminding him of the squeaky floorboard in the hallway, and the reason we never fixed it because he loved the sound of its creak during thunderstorms. It made him feel safe. To my daughter-in-law, I had left a few pieces of my jewelry, not because I thought she'd wear them, but because I believed she might one day open the box and understand what it meant that I wanted to include her. I thought perhaps foolishly that if she held one of my old brooches or ran her fingers over the cameo I wore on my wedding day, she might see me differently, not as a relic, but as someone with her own youth, her own heart, her own dreams. I had even divided some of my savings among them with specific instructions: money for education, travel, a little fund for dream projects, as I had written in the margin. Because I wanted them to do more than just live, I wanted them to flourish. But looking at it now, the ink had dulled. Not just from time, but from the weariness I now felt. The warmth that had once filled each paragraph was gone. It had been eroded by years of silence, chipped away by small humiliations, and finally swept aside by one too many dismissive smiles. I realized I had written this will as a letter to people I thought still saw me, still valued me. Now I knew better. I held it in my hands, the paper soft at the folds, and I didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle in my bones, a finality that didn't feel cold. It felt earned, like the last page of a long chapter that had run out of reasons to continue. I ran my fingers along the margin where I'd once doodled a little leaf in the corner. I remembered thinking how poetic it was, how we scatter parts of ourselves across pages, hoping someone will read between the lines. But I wasn't sure they ever had, or ever would. I thought of the people who would one day read this. Would they glance at it once, then toss it to an accountant? Would they argue over the house, or laugh at the jewelry? Would they forget the note tucked under the photo frame in the hallway? Or worse, would they expect it? Would they see it not as a gift, but as their right? That thought stayed with me longer than I'd like to admit. The entitlement, the assumption, the way people sometimes treat love, not as a gift freely given, but as a currency owed to them for merely existing in proximity. I folded the document gently, then opened my desk drawer and pulled out a clean notepad. No emotion, no second-guessing, just purpose. At the top I wrote "New Will," and beneath it in smaller letters for the ones who remembered me when it wasn't convenient. I began with the house, not to my son, but to a local women's shelter I had donated to for years. A place where children's laughter was a miracle, not a memory, where mothers rebuilt from nothing, where a house wasn't a symbol of status, but of survival. I imagined my rooms filled with the noise of new beginnings. That thought made me feel lighter. Next, I turned to the savings, some of it to charities I believed in, literacy programs, elder care foundations, meal services for those who had no one left. I knew what it meant to feel invisible. I didn't want others to suffer quietly the way I had. And then came the rest. A portion for my granddaughter, the only one who had ever really looked at me and seen something there. Even as a child, she had a way of sitting next to me, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like my presence wasn't just tolerated, it was a comfort. She once spent an entire Saturday brushing my hair, telling me she thought silver was prettier than gold. She said I reminded her of a fairy from her picture books. I remembered thinking that was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in years. She would understand, not just the gift, but the why. When I finished my notes, I sat back in my chair and let the morning sun stretch across the desk. It felt like permission, like grace, like taking the first breath after being underwater for too long. I hadn't done anything drastic, not yet, just a list, just ink on paper. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was holding the pen in my own life again. No longer the background, no longer the afterthought. I had spent years writing myself out of the story so others could shine. Now, I was writing myself back in. The following week, I called my lawyer's office. The same small firm I'd used for over 20 years, local, reliable, quiet. Margaret answered the phone. her voice still as warm and precise as I remembered. She'd been the receptionist there since before my husband passed. She remembered birthdays, always asked after my garden, and never once made me feel like I was taking up too much of her time. When I told her I needed to revise my will, there was a pause, just long enough to feel it. Then she said gently, "Of course, dear. We'll get you in this week. How's Thursday at 10? Thursday arrived with the kind of weather I always loved, cool, overcast, a little misty, like the world was wrapped in a shawl. I wore my softest sweater and brought along my notes, folded neatly in an envelope, my name written in small cursive at the corner. As I walked through the door, the little bell above chimed its familiar welcome, and I felt something settle inside me. This wasn't dramatic. This wasn't a scene. This was business. Calm, quiet, decisive. Mr. Linton. Robert greeted me with the same firm handshake and gentle eyes. He looked older, as we all did, his hair now completely white and thinner than before. But his kindness hadn't aged a day. "It's good to see you, Mrs. Harper," he said, gesturing toward the worn leather chair across from his desk. "What can I help you with today?" I handed him the envelope. "I'd like to make some changes," I said, "substantial ones." He nodded slowly, taking the papers, unfolding them with care. He read the first page in silence, his brow creasing slightly, but not in judgment. I could see it in his face. He'd seen this before. The gentle erosion of families. The way years of giving could be met with years of forgetting. He didn't need me to explain. Still I spoke, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with truth. I just want the things I've built, the things I've saved, to go where they'll matter. Not where they're expected, not where they'll be taken for granted. He nodded again. Understood. May I ask, do you want to notify your son of the change? I paused, not because I hadn't thought of it, but because I had, over and over. The look on his face when he eventually found out, the confusion, the guilt maybe, or maybe just more of that same quiet indifference I'd felt for years. I looked out the window where a maple tree stood, its leaves just beginning to turn. "No," I said finally, "let the will speak for itself." He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me otherwise. He simply started writing. We went through it line by line, the house, the savings, the heirlooms, the donation clauses, the granddaughter's share, the charities. I signed where needed, asked questions when I had them, and with each step I felt something inside me lift, not vindication, not revenge, just realignment. At one point he looked up and asked softly, "Are you sure?" And I smiled, not big, not bold, but real. "Yes," I said. "For the first time in a very long time, I am." He handed me a copy to keep and said he'd file the official version by the end of the day. As I gathered my coat and purse, he stood to walk me out. And just before I opened the door, he said something that stayed with me. "You're not the first mother to sit in that chair and realize it's okay to stop giving to people who only take." I didn't cry, but I did place a hand over my chest where something warm had begun to bloom. Outside, the sky was still gray, but the light was shifting more silver than steel now. I walked slowly to my car, the envelope pressed against my side like a secret I was finally ready to keep. The trees rustled gently overhead, and I felt in the stillness that I had finally chosen myself, not in a selfish way, not out of spite, but because I had remembered love should be a gift, not a debt. And I would no longer be paying interest on a loan no one intended to repay. I drove home with the window slightly open, the wind tugging at my sleeve like a whisper. I wasn't thinking about who would be angry or who would feel betrayed. I was thinking of peace, of how quiet it is when you stop waiting for someone else to value you. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a while watching the porch. My porch, my home, my decision. I didn't need applause. I didn't need anyone to say good for you. I just needed to remember that I still had the right to decide what my love was worth and where it belonged. The next morning, the air was crisp with the promise of fall. I stepped out into the garden, mug in hand, wrapped in my shawl, and listened to the world stir. A bird called from the neighbor's tree, and the breeze smelled faintly of earth and fading roses. I stood there for a long while, breathing it in. I hadn't felt this quiet in years. Not the silence of being forgotten, but the silence of finally hearing myself. I walked to the corner of the yard where I kept my little bench beneath the arbor my husband built long ago. The vines had grown over it now, thick and knotted, but somehow still lovely. I brushed off a few leaves and sat letting the sun warm my legs. I pulled a folded letter from my pocket, one I'd written to my granddaughter the night before, just after coming back from the lawyer's office. It wasn't long, just a few lines in my careful cursive, the same way I used to write birthday cards, and tuck them under her pillow during sleepovers. Sweetheart, I hope when this reaches you, you'll know how deeply you were seen and how your kindness reached me in ways I can never repay. This isn't about money. It's about love. It's about legacy. And yours is the only heart I've felt still open. I hope you use it well, and that someday you'll do the same for someone else who's been made to feel small. With all my heart, Grandma. I folded it again and tucked it into an envelope. I didn't feel dramatic. I felt clear. Because something had shifted, not only in my will, but in my will to protect my love. Not to throw it at people like a bouquet, hoping someone catches it, but to place it carefully, intentionally, where it would be held. I began thinking of others too. People I'd forgotten in the noise of trying to be enough for a family that never looked up. My neighbor Joan, who brought soup when I had the flu, and sat with me when the house felt too big. The woman at the library who always remembered the books I liked, who slipped me a handwritten list of recommendations after my husband passed. A cousin I hadn't seen in years, who sent me a letter after the funeral and said he was the lucky one. None of them ever asked for anything, but they gave, in little ways, with full hearts. And that's where I wanted to leave my legacy, not in sterile bank transfers and legal notices, but in warm places where a little generosity still meant something. I began a new list, names, faces, memories, not of who had asked for my love, but who had earned it simply by being kind when I had nothing left to offer in return. I would send the locket to my granddaughter with the letter. The scarves I'd made I would donate to a women's support center downtown, and the old books I'd kept in the hope that someone might one day ask to read them. I packed them lovingly in a box and wrote a note to the head librarian. These stories gave me company when I needed it. I hope they find someone else who needs them too. And the money what I had saved over the years through thrift and sacrifice, I would place it in the hands of people doing good work. The shelter, the literacy fund, a small grant for older women returning to school. I wanted to give other women what I never received in my later years, a second wind, a fresh page. It wasn't about punishing anyone. That's what I kept telling myself, and it was true. I wasn't burning bridges. I was building new ones, just not in the direction everyone expected. Because love, when it's real, isn't about obligation. It's about presence, and presence is sacred. You don't leave it in places where people roll their eyes and call it cheap. You leave it where someone will pick it up and say, "This matters." For so long, I told myself that withholding anything from my son would make me cruel, that choosing myself would make me selfish, that changing the will would be a betrayal. But now I saw the real betrayal had already happened quietly over the years. Every time they looked through me, Every time they laughed at me when they thought I wasn't listening. Every time they opened their hands for what I gave and never once asked how I was holding up. So I chose to leave love where it had been returned. That afternoon, I baked an apple pie, not for anyone else, but for me. I let the cinnamon fill the house, let the warmth reach the rooms that had grown too still. I sliced it, sat down at the kitchen table and took a bite. And I thought, this is what it feels like to feed yourself first. No performance, no pretending. Just a woman in her own home reclaiming the pieces of herself she gave away too cheaply. And this time I would not apologize for it. A few days later, I took a bus into the city, not because I had to, but because I wanted time to watch the world pass by in slow motion. Trees blurred into gold and rust along the roadside. A mother adjusted her baby's hat. A boy pressed his nose to the glass. Life unfolding in quiet snapshots. It reminded me that even in the stillness of loss, there is movement. Always. I held the envelope in my lap, the one with the letter and the old locket wrapped in soft muslin, tied with a piece of thread from one of my own worn scarves. My hands rested on it like it was something holy, because to me it was, not for what it was worth, but for what it meant. She lived in a small apartment just off campus, a third-year university student studying literature, just like I once dreamed of doing before life called me elsewhere. I didn't call ahead. I didn't want her to clean up or make tea or fuss. I just wanted to see her, to place this part of my heart somewhere I knew it would be held with care. When she opened the door, her face lit up, like the porch lanterns we used to hang during summer nights back home. "Grandma," she said, and in that one word I felt years of neglect and noise fall away. I was someone to her, not an obligation, not a relic, not background. She hugged me tightly without rush, and when she pulled back I saw something rare in young eyes these days: attentiveness, presence. She gestured me in clearing a stack of books from a chair, apologizing for the clutter. I laughed and told her it was nothing compared to what my sewing room used to look like. We talked for a while, nothing heavy. She told me about a poetry class she loved, a professor who encouraged her, a paper she was nervous about. I listened like someone drinking water after a long drought. And then, as the late afternoon sun streaked across her floor, I handed her the envelope. Her brow furrowed. "What's this?" "Just something I want you to have," I said. "No special occasion." She opened it slowly, pulled out the note first. I watched her read it, the way her eyes moved, the way her fingers trembled just slightly. When she looked up, they were glistening, not with confusion, not with entitlement, but with understanding. She opened the small wrapped bundle, unfolded the muslin, and let the locket fall into her palm. "This was yours," she said softly, tracing the delicate gold edge. "I remember it from your dresser." I nodded. "It's older than you, older than your father. I wore it on my wedding day. But it's not the object that matters, it's the memory that lives in it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked at me, really looked, and said, "Thank you for trusting me with this." And then after a pause, she whispered the words no one else had said to me in years. "I'm sorry for the way they've treated you. I don't know everything, but I see it. I've seen it." I didn't expect her to say that. I hadn't come for sympathy. But those words landed inside me like balm on a burn. I see it. That was all I had ever wanted, to be seen. I reached across the small table and took her hand. "You don't have to carry their choices," I told her, "but you do get to choose your own. And I've chosen you, because you've never made me feel like I had to prove my worth." She blinked back tears. "I won't forget that, Grandma. I promise." And I believed her. She wore the locket as I left, said she'd keep it close always. I stepped back out into the early evening, the sky dipped in lavender and gold, and felt something inside me sigh, not from sadness, but from release. It's easy to think that love wasted is love lost, but it's not. Love misdirected can be reclaimed, re-gifted, redirected towards someone who knows how to hold it gently, towards someone who doesn't laugh at a gift chosen with care or toss aside a life's worth of effort. That visit reminded me that I hadn't failed. I had simply been giving to people who had long stopped receiving. But here was someone who drank it in like sunlight, who saw the lineage of my life not as something outdated, but as a legacy worth carrying forward. On the ride home, I watched the city lights blur past. I thought about all the years I spent feeling like I was giving into a void, and now I knew I just needed to turn a little to point my heart in a new direction. And now that I had, oh, how easily it shone. It didn't take long for the news to travel. A change in a will, especially one that doesn't follow the assumed path, has a strange way of echoing into rooms I no longer sit in. I hadn't told them. I hadn't warned or threatened. I'd done nothing theatrical, but something in the air must have shifted because they felt it. You can always feel when something you took for granted is no longer yours. It began with a phone call from my son, late evening, a few days after my visit to my granddaughter. His voice was oddly tight, polite, in that brittle way people become when they're trying not to show their hand too early. "Hey, Mom, just wanted to check in, see how you're doing." I closed my eyes and smiled softly. There it is, I thought, the first ripple. I said I was well, nothing more, nothing less. He hesitated. "We were thinking maybe you'd like to come over next weekend. Just a little dinner, nothing fancy." I could hear her in the background, not saying anything but close, listening, monitoring, orchestrating, and suddenly I felt such deep exhaustion, not because I was angry, but because I was done performing. I had played the part of the grateful, available mother for so long that now even their attention felt like a transaction. "That's kind of you," I replied, "but I already have plans." He faltered. "Oh, well, maybe another time then." "Maybe," I said. And I meant it, not as a threat, not as a door slammed shut, but as a quiet truth. Maybe. Because I no longer needed to say yes just to keep the illusion of closeness alive. The next day I received a delivery at my doorstep, a bouquet, roses white and blush pink arranged with precision. No note, just a printed card that read, "Thinking of you." I almost laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of recognition. This was the ripple, the sudden awareness that the ground had shifted, that the woman they expected to orbit around them had planted her feet somewhere else. Later that week, a text from my daughter-in-law, friendly, bright, overcompensating. "I saw the most beautiful vintage linens the other day, made me think of you. We should go shopping sometime." Vintage linens. I could still hear her voice from the party. Looks like something from a thrift store. The memory of that moment didn't hurt as sharply anymore. Now it sat in me like a stone worn smooth by water. I had carried it, examined it, and set it down. I didn't need an apology, not anymore. What I needed was truth, and now I had it. I didn't respond to the text, not to punish her, but because I didn't owe her anything. Silence, I realized, is not always a wound. Sometimes it's a boundary. Sometimes it's grace. Then came the messages from extended family. A cousin I hadn't heard from in years suddenly tagging me in photos online, sending a message about how we should catch up soon. A niece who once rolled her eyes when I spoke about my garden, now asking if I still grew peonies. The ripple was widening. People who had once overlooked me now remembered my name. But here's the thing about attention that comes after the fact: it can't rewrite what you chose to ignore the first time. The belated warmth, the forced affection. It was all too late to undo the steady erosion of years, and I had no desire to play pretend anymore. Instead, I turned toward the places where the ripple didn't feel like manipulation, but like recognition. Joan, my neighbor, brought over a casserole and sat with me on the porch. We didn't speak of wills or money. We spoke of music, and how the clouds had been unusually soft that week. She didn't know anything had changed. She didn't need to. Her kindness had always been real, and that's all that mattered. I received a letter from the shelter I'd written into the new will, a handwritten note, simple and pure. Your generosity will help 5 families move into safe housing this year. You've given them more than a home, you've given them a second chance. I held that letter to my chest and cried, not the kind of tears that ache, the kind that release, because for the first time I knew that what I was leaving behind would bloom, not be stashed in drawers or sold on auction sites. It would live. The ripple of my decision wasn't destruction, it was redirection. I hadn't shattered anything. I had simply stopped pouring my energy into vessels that never held me. I had turned slowly and with grace toward places that still knew how to receive. And as the days passed, the noise began to quiet. The texts slowed, the calls stopped, the silence returned, but this time it was mine. And I welcomed it, because the ripple hadn't broken me. It had brought me home. The envelope was heavy with pretense, cream-colored embossed lettering, a wax seal pressed into the back flap, like it was something sacred. When I slid it from the mailbox, I didn't have to open it to know what it was. I could feel the performance radiating from it like perfume. Her birthday, another gathering, another chance to sit quietly at the edge of their celebration and pretend I belonged. I stood on my porch, the sun warming the wood beneath my slippers, and let my fingers trace the name scrolled across the front. Mrs. Evelyn Harper. Formal, polished, distant, like they were inviting a role, not a person. Inside the card was thick with glossy flourishes, elegant script, a photo printed on the left, a candid of her, laughing in a sun hat. She looked carefree, untouched. It was printed like a magazine ad, like a life curated for admiration. Beneath it, the details: cocktails at 6, dinner at 8, valet parking available. Dress code, semi-formal. I stood there a while, reading it twice, then again, as if repetition might somehow reveal something new. But it didn't. It was all there. The smile, the surface, the absence of anything that truly mattered. No mention of me, of course, just the expectation of presence, the assumption that I would show up because I always had. I set the card down and walked inside. My hands didn't shake, my breath didn't falter, because something had settled in me since the last time they'd laughed at my gift, since I stood alone in their kitchen pretending not to feel invisible, since I drove home in the dark and realized I didn't need their light to see myself clearly anymore. I took out a piece of stationery from my drawer, plain white, no border, no embellishments. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling beside me and began to write. Thank you for the invitation. I won't be attending this year. Please give my regards to the other guests. I didn't offer a reason. I didn't mention prior commitments or health. I didn't apologize, because no apology was necessary for choosing my peace over their performance. I folded the note, slid it into a matching envelope, and addressed it in my steady, looping script. As I walked it to the mailbox, I felt something loosen in my chest, like I had finally stepped outside of an old costume I didn't realize I'd been wearing. The woman who always said yes, who always came when called, who always smiled through disappointment. That woman had earned her rest. That evening, I sat by the fire with a book I'd meant to reread for years. The birthday came and went. I saw pictures online, people laughing, glasses, raised glittering dresses caught in flash. And there she was at the center, radiant and untouched as always. I didn't feel bitter. I didn't feel left out. I felt separate. And that separation no longer hurt. It just was. The next day, a text from my son. "Hey, we missed you last night. Everything okay?" I stared at the screen for a moment. I didn't answer right away. I walked outside, let the breeze tangle my hair, let the scent of lavender from the garden wrap around me. When I came back in, I replied, "Yes, everything is just fine. Hope the night went well." Nothing more. Because sometimes what people miss is not you, it's the version of you who never said no, the one who always arrived, gift in hand, heart wide open, ready to swallow whatever was handed back. And sometimes when you stop showing up, they begin to wonder why, but not deeply enough to change, just enough to notice the absence. And I was okay with that, because this time my absence was not a loss. It was a boundary. I lit a candle and watched the flame dance soft and sure. I thought of all the times I'd dressed carefully, chosen words, cautiously prepared myself for rooms that made me feel small, and how now I had chosen instead to stay in the company of my own stillness, to dress in comfort, to speak only truth, to no longer make myself smaller just to fit. They would move on, plan the next gathering, stage the next moment, and perhaps my name would come up now and then. Perhaps they'd wonder, perhaps not. But I would not return to a table where I had been uninvited in all the ways that matter. I had a new table now. It was quiet. It was mine. And every place at it was earned. There was no grand finale, no confrontation, no dramatic phone call filled with tears and accusations. Just silence. A different kind this time, one that didn't ache, didn't sting, didn't whisper that I had been forgotten. No, this silence felt earned. It was the sound of my own breath returning to me, the sound of choosing myself over and over again, until the noise of needing them dulled to a distant murmur. The days slipped by gently. I tended to my garden. I repainted the old bench under the arbor a pale green that reminded me of spring. I sat with my tea in the early mornings, watching the sun spill like gold across the grass, and I smiled more easily now, soft smiles, the kind that bloom quietly in the corners of the mouth without needing to be seen by anyone else. Sometimes I would glance at my phone and see nothing, no texts, no calls, and instead of the old ache rising in my chest, I felt a calm stretch through me like a warm shawl. I didn't need to be wanted. I didn't need their invitations to feel real. I had begun inviting myself to my own life. There were moments, of course, when a pang would visit me, a flash of memory, my son's laugh as a boy, his hand in mine as we crossed the street, a drawing he once made of us two stick figures, holding hands, both smiling. I let those memories pass through me, not as wounds, but as truths. I had loved, I had given, and that part of me would never disappear. But loving someone does not mean enduring the erosion of yourself. That was the difference I now understood. Sometimes I would hear her voice in my head. It looked so cheap, but even that no longer stabbed. It simply floated past like old smoke, faded, powerless. I began writing again, not for anyone else, just for me. Short reflections, snippets of memory, things I wanted to preserve, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were mine. I wrote about the day I taught my granddaughter how to make bread, the way her fingers got tangled in the dough, the flour on her nose, the way she looked at me, like I had magic in my hands. I wrote about my husband's laugh, the weight of his coat on the hook by the door, how the house never quite smelled the same without his cologne. I wrote about my silence, not as emptiness, but as a language I was learning to speak with fluency. One day I took a walk to the little park near the library. I sat on the same bench I used to bring my son to when he was small. I watched children play in the distance, their joy loud and unfiltered. A young mother passed by and smiled at me, not out of pity, just kindness, and I smiled back, and it felt like enough. When I got home that evening, I made myself a small dinner, roasted vegetables, a soft roll, a glass of wine. I lit a candle and let it flicker in the quiet, and as I ate, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting for recognition or closure or justice, because I already had it. It lived in every decision I'd made since I stopped asking permission to be valued. It lived in the letter I'd written to my granddaughter. It lived in the revised will resting quietly in my desk drawer. It lived in every no I had uttered without explanation. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. They would never know what it had cost me to stay soft for so long, but I knew, and I had stopped paying that price. My life now was smaller in some ways, quieter, less filled with the constant noise of others' expectations, but it was fuller in the ways that mattered, full of agency, full of clarity, full of peace. I didn't burn bridges. I simply stopped crossing them. I didn't slam doors. I just stopped leaving them ajar for people who never knocked. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off, and in that quiet I found myself again. The days come slower now. Time stretches like soft fabric across the arms of the morning, and I no longer rush to fill it. I move through the hours like I'm treading water in a warm sea, steady, unhurried, held. There's power in stillness, I've learned, in not explaining, in not reaching, in letting people sit with the absence they created. I've stopped performing love where it isn't honored. I've stopped offering grace to those who treat it like spare change, and in its place, I've learned a quieter kind of love, one that begins with myself and ends only where it is wanted. There's an old clock on my mantel that ticks just slightly out of rhythm. It's never quite right, but it's never truly wrong either. It reminds me of life now, imperfect, unpolished, but beating in time with something real, something mine. I water my plants, I write my little thoughts, I send letters without expecting replies. I breathe in the air from the open window and let the light land where it will. And I no longer grieve what I lost, because what I've found is better. It's me, my voice, my peace, my worth. And it was never cheap, not ever. I gave them silence, and in it I found peace.